Hi, everybody. It's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. Happy to have you with me. We're talking about investing in novel proteins today. Who's getting the big bucks? It looks like fermented proteins are taking a lot of the dollars. We'll talk about those statistics and more when I bring on today's guest. He is a business executive, but primarily someone who is deploying capital and technology as an engineer, looking to scale up novel proteins in the space. I want to welcome Mark Warner with me today from Liberation Labs.
Great, thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Yes. So I didn't give your bio really full justice because it is so long and good, but I do just want to repeat to people that you're an engineer by trade, but you have been working so long now with the likes of Harris Group, which primarily was focusing on alternative energy, as I understand it, Solazyme working on algae and oils, and of course, Impossible Foods, which is maybe where people know you best as you deployed technology to scale up alternative proteins. Really, they're focusing on their alt animal hemes. So the fermented proteins from yeast. And then from there, you started Warner Advisors, where you were helping companies either create their own factories or scale up other factories. I wasn't sure if you were helping them find co-manufacturing opportunities or if you were helping them scale up their own factories.
It's to some degree, all of the above. I've been in the novel biotech space since 2004, started in the biofuels days, transitioned to biochemicals. It's really been food focus for about the last 10 years or so. As you mentioned, I was in-house at both Solazyme and Impossible Foods, helped scale up. And when I left Impossible, it's been almost 7 years ago now. I was there in the very early days. I've consulted with over 100 startup companies since then, helping them develop their own technology, and in some cases, potentially look at building their own facility. Unfortunately, over the years of consulting, people have talked a lot about building the capacity, but unfortunately, not a lot of it has gotten built. So recently decided to take a jump, and with a co-founder, Eitan Bentheim, who's also been in the industry for a while, decided to form a venture to try and bring on some large-scale fermentation capacity to really fill the gap and the need that's out there today.
So that's Liberation Labs,
Correct.
Is that you're trying to fill that need. But let me understand this. So are you trying to build capacity and others would co-opt that out and they would rent it
Correct.
from you?
What some would call co-manufacturing, or it's a manufacturing platform. So today, most of the proteins, the novel proteins in the space, are made at a legacy network of fermentation facilities. Average age about 40 years old. But the important part was they weren't built to make food proteins. It's not that they can't make food proteins. They were predominantly built for pharmaceuticals. Some were built for chemicals, but they don't do it all that efficiently. They're fairly costly. They don't have the efficiency. A theme you'll hear from me, and part of the reason we jumped into Liberation Labs, is there's a lot of people making the proteins today. Few were able to make it at the cost that is where we need it to be competitive. And that really comes from scale, large facilities. If you look at how food's manufactured today, it's very large facilities, and it's also having a facility in the right place. Right now, these facilities are where you would build pharmaceutical facilities predominantly. They're not always where you would build food facilities. So when you look at even the cost structure, the goal here is to purpose-build facilities to service the novel protein industry.
That's fascinating, because that was going to be my next question. Why can't we just repurpose assets from the pharmaceutical industry? And I had never considered location as a reason why that might not be the right fit. Of course, when you look at the price structure of pharmaceuticals, they can charge so much more than we can for, let's say, commodities, food products, things like protein. So I understand the scaling differential, but is the technology generally the same?
It's generally the same. As I like to say, it's somewhat the same. And most of the technologies we use to make novel proteins comes from pharmaceuticals as a source. It just has become much more economical. And what I mean by that is, you say, pharmaceuticals is much smaller scale. A 5 or 10,000 liter fermenter is a good size fermenter in the pharmaceutical space. In the food space, you'd be looking at hundreds of thousands of liters per fermenter. So the other thing is where the facilities are located. So when you look at a large scale commercial fermentation facility, three things make up 75% of the cost: power, sugar, and labor. So first, people are often surprised that power is so big. They use a lot of electricity, they use a lot of sugar, and the labor is a large component. So the where you need to put these facilities are where you can get all three of those economically in places like the US Midwest. Last facility I built was in Brazil. Today, most of the facilities that people are using, the former pharmacy facilities, predominantly are in Europe. They're good facilities. The people are doing great with them, but they're 40, 50 years old. So they don't have as modern of controls. They often aren't as efficient. So again, they can make it. It's really an economic issue in many cases.
So this is fascinating to me, so much to discover here. And I hope it's true for my listeners that this is a little bit of fermented proteins engineering 101 for me. So I apologize if it's elementary for you. But of course, that makes sense in the Midwest when you're looking at labor costs. And also, ultimately, you want to use this technology to make proteins where there are already food cities like Chicago, which is such a headquarters for food manufacturing, as this technology goes into food products and then it gets distributed across the United States. So I love that you talk about labor, where labor is going to be cheaper, but also sugar in VegTech Invest, where we are focusing on companies that are innovating with plants and plant-derived ingredients to create animal-free products. A lot of people ask us, why would fermented proteins and cultivated meat be part of your plant-based innovation? Well, it's because this sugar is such a key component for cultivated meat and fermented proteins. So now you also mentioned a third component, electricity. Can these facilities be alt energy powered?
Oh, definitely. And many of them are. Facility I built in Brazil was used biomass power as an example. Something you just said, I think that's important. So we use fermentation generically, and I think it's important to differentiate.
Please.
We're really focused on what we're calling precision fermentation, which is, I think, Good Food Institute did a very good job of differentiating. Precision fermentation are more of the what I'll call higher value functionality products. Impossible's heme, when added to agriculture ingredients, makes it like a burger. Perfect Day's casein, Clara's egg protein. They have a functionality to them. You're not just buying them because they replace a protein. They bring a value, very often, adding value to a lower cost agricultural protein to make it more like a replicate. That's in contrast to something like a mycelium. Think of the mycelium products to make steak type replicates and things. That's more of what they would call a biomass protein, a whole cell protein. Both have a need, but they're very different. We're really focusing on that precision fermentation that makes the higher value, higher functionality products that are often added with agricultural ingredients to make the end product.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. Thank you for that. So you're really talking about not the end product, because a biomass fermented product would be an end product, really. And here you're talking about a critical input to making something like Brave Robot function, if I understand it correctly. Yes. Something that surprised me that you said is that pharmaceuticals have much smaller capacity. Now, when I think of pharmaceuticals, I think of an enormous demand around the world, particularly so much of what we use going into animal agriculture. So you think of not just the people on the planet who are using the pharmaceutical industry, but the 10 times more animals factory farmed on the planet that are also using these pharmaceutical products. So I'm surprised that food, maybe let me clarify, are you thinking projected numbers, food should have larger capacity? Or are you saying that demand now for fermented proteins is larger than pharmaceuticals?
No, what I'm saying is the physical size of the facility. So again, I'm coming back to economics. A pharmaceutical facility generally has smaller reactors. If you're think of how much drugs cost. They cost way more per unit than food costs. So you can make them in a much smaller fermenter So, usually the facilities that get used most for
I
food are
see.
things like former antibiotics facilities, things that made penicillin and other things maybe in the 60s or 70s. Those are what I would consider the largest side of pharmaceuticals. But as you start getting into many of the pharmaceutical facilities, they're much smaller in scale, where when you look at the food industry, you're going to need facilities in the millions of liters to be able to make a lot of these food products economical enough to be competitive with their existing animal products today.
Hmm. Yes. So, really, what we're talking about is a function of scale. To keep those prices
Correct.
low, you need to get that enormous quantity. And we are talking about feeding the world now in a very different way, not just for perhaps more nutritious foods, but more prolific output and certainly better use of our resources.
Mhm.
So, very exciting. Let me just clarify something. For Warner Advisors, you were helping others build their own manufacturing plants. But
Correct.
here, you're actually thinking of a manufacturing plant that you would then be the
Mhm.
co-manufacturer, and you would take many companies at once, correct?
Correct. And the reason being, it's difficult for a lot of these companies. They don't have a lot of expertise, and they're scientists and discovery. Not all of them have the ability to build and run a facility that frankly costs hundreds of millions of dollars. And there's also just capital efficiency reasons why running at very large scale, one facility serving multiple clients can be much more efficient than companies building their individual facilities. And some will, it's certainly an option that's out there. But if you look at, what I would say is this is similar to how the pharmaceutical industry is done today.
Hmm.
The vaccines we all got, generally, there's very few groups that both develop a drug and manufacture the drug. In the pharmaceutical industry, you have a very mature developing industry and manufacturing industry. That's never come to the industrial biotech space. And we believe that's a platform that makes a lot more sense in both the capital efficiency and the cost structure. Because again, it's very hard for a small organization that spent 5, 7 years doing discovery in biology to all of a sudden be experts in large stainless steel tanks and how to build them and where to source the sugar and things. So, we believe it's kind of the natural next evolution of where the industry needs to go.
And of course, this makes so much sense. If you are an innovator and you're focused on the innovation behind the food and running that
Hmm.
business, which is its own behemoth business, then to, as you say, the production schedule can be 24/7, and then you
Hmm.
have to manage that, and you have to find someone who can be a full-time person, and all the things that can go wrong, and just the amount of capital that would be
Hmm.
needed, and the kind of venture capital raised, if venture capitalists are even willing to do it. Often they will
Hmm.
only fund innovation and not infrastructure, so there's another hurdle there. It makes so much sense. Why haven't we done it?
Two reasons. You mentioned one, the capital. Venture capital comes out of the mindset of computers. That's where a lot of them came. They like paying for software. They don't want to pay for hardware. I've heard that a few thousand times over
Me
my
too.
career. So that's the model. But the problem is we've gotten to a point where we have all kinds of software, but not a computer in sight to run it on. So I think you're seeing that change. We've had very strong interest in it. And I also think it's just, it, it has to happen for these ventures to start monetizing their technology. And,
Mhm.
something I'd like to add about, why it's hard for these companies to do it. It's a very different mindset. I've managed both R&D organizations and manufacturing, and they're very different. Um, R&D is about discovery, doing things new, pushing boundaries and changing every day. Manufacturing is about doing the same thing day after day to
Mhm.
make a consistent, repeatable product. As I like to say, neither's good or bad, neither's better than the other. They're just very different. And for an organization to pivot from one to it's no easier for an R&D organization to pivot and become a manufacturing organization. There's plenty of manufacturing organizations that decide they're going to go into R&D and have difficulty too. So we
Mhm.
think that's one of the reasons it makes sense for this platform to service the industry.
Mhm. Yes, you can see why those are two completely opposing jobs, and one should maybe not
Mhm.
do the other. It can't be a specialist really in both. But it has taken a while for us to get here. To my knowledge, Liberation Labs is the only co-manufacturing vision for fermented proteins. If there's something else out there that's
There's others that have talked about it over the years. Certainly, we think we're on a clear path. Our two initial, we just got our initial founding funding earlier this year. We're backed by Agronomics and CPT. Two of the bigger groups invested in the space, and that was important to us because they understand. You mentioned that people haven't wanted to spend venture capital on this. There's a belief by those two entities that this needs to move forward. If we can get debt along the way, great, but we're going to move forward to prove this out, on equity if we need to, because we believe the industry is not going to succeed if we don't bring more capacity on it. I hearken back to my biofuels days, and I remember there used to be, in the days of cellulosic ethanol, there was all these great talk about these technologies, but people would say, where are the gallons? I hear all this great talk about how these technologies are going to change the world, but I can't buy it at my local gas station. It's still not displacing that much. I would argue we're somewhat there today in alternate proteins. There's a lot of good technologies out there. We're really not displacing a significant
Mhm.
material amount today, and that needs to change, both to make the impact that we want on the earth, and also from the standpoint of these companies have to start making revenue and money. We need to, the return, and I think we can say it both in biofuels and even in the alternate protein space, there's been a lot of money come in, but we haven't seen the returns that will drive continued investment. And that's one thing we hope to be able to help drive.
So let's talk about that a little bit. First of all, I'll just say I don't know the number that is in alt energy and biofuels, but certainly alt protein isn't anything close. If I go to the Good Food Institute numbers ending for 2021, it looks like fermented proteins brought in 1.7 billion out of the 5 billion that was
Mhm.
garnered for 2021. So fermented proteins jumping up quite a bit, taking a lion's share where it used to be just a fraction, or taking a significant share where it used to be just a fraction, but
Mhm.
that's all going towards innovation. So we have all these innovators, but no real possibility of scaling. And if you don't scale, you really don't have an
Yeah.
industry. You have a bunch of great ideas and a bunch of wonderful
Mhm.
promises, but you don't have anything tangible. So it seems that now is the time. At the same time, we have an economy, both public and private markets. I believe Good Food Institute says that venture capital is down by 23% this year, down 9% for alternative proteins. That might be Q2, not for the half of the
Mhm.
year. But alternative proteins down less, but still down, and overall venture capital down about 23%. Obviously, the public markets also down quite a bit. Um, is the timing right for you? Because where previously venture capitalists would have said, no, I'm going to back the big ideas, the unicorn.
Mhm.
Now the numbers and the valuations coming down and everyone getting a little bit more realistic. Maybe they're saying, hey, I should go for the nuts and bolts and the guns and butter, or whatever people say,
Mhm.
and be less pie in the sky and more about the smaller returns but consistency.
And what the second one of you said, they've referred to us often as picks and shovels,
Thank
but
you. Picks and
um,
shovels.
you know, we've actually had very, very strong interest, and I think it's some of what you said. The valuations across the industry had been, I think we could use the word robust.
Yes, we
Um,
could.
so what I've seen is there's a lot of desire of ventures to put infrastructure money into the space, and I'm not just talking governments. Um, Most of them are waiting for it to be de-risked a little more, to see one of these newer facilities operate and see the economics of it, and also the market offtake. I don't want to minimize that. We've made a lot of progress. There's still some challenges there. I think part of the reason you've seen the kick up in the Good Food Institute on what I would say is really the precision proteins recently is it's just a little longer adoption cycle. If you're a ingredient going into a product, it takes longer to get into the market through a consumer products company than something that maybe is a wholesale product, which is a direct to consumer. Again, I think there's a lot of belief that the precision proteins will add a lot to really making a lot of these products what people want to buy. It's just, we often minimize, those of us with the technology background, the consumer adoption cycle, which is, it does take time. And I think that's been some of what has dragged things out a little bit.
There's so much to unpack there. When I think of it taking time, so you have the consumer adoption curve, but you also have, for me, in my non-engineering mind, I think that fermented proteins have a head start because they have the knowledge from the pharmaceutical industry. This might not be correct, so you just correct me if I'm wrong. So some of that IP is already in existence and can be built upon. Is that accurate?
It is, but what I'm talking about is more just the regular product development cycle.
Yeah.
So if you're a big multinational CPG and you're going to use this novel protein to make some new food product, generally what will happen is that's about an 18-month cycle, 12 to 18 months. You'll get a small amount of product from the company. You'll make some initial product samples in maybe your corporate R&D lab, and you'll say, hey, we think we could sell this. This is, a very novel product. Then you'll go back, get a lot more of the product, maybe, a couple hundred kilograms, make a lot more product, go out to some focus groups, do the things. And this is just the normal consumer product development cycle that's being fed into that. Having been in the space a long time, I've seen companies underestimate what it's going to take for an ingredient to get into a final product. Doesn't mean it won't get there, but I see people get frustrated that they think the day they make their novel protein, somebody's going to have it on the shelf in a product the next month. It's not generally how the big food companies develop their products. They're all about brand and reputation. And, if they roll out a new product that for some reason doesn't meet expectation, that's something that is very detrimental to them.
Sure. And in a way, when you have that novel protein, the innovation cycle for that larger company has just begun. Now they need to make the right product with it. So there's, that added time, as you correctly say. But I think it's interesting. We already have fermented proteins on the market. So we have Perfect Day. You mentioned them before, with products out there by Brave Robot ice cream and Grater's ice cream. And I believe they have a milk. I think it's called Betterland milk. You have the Every company you mentioned out there with a juice company putting their egg whites into, I think it's pressed juice out there. So you have companies that are already working on these. And so I feel like the consumer is already starting to hear about them, but I'm not sure about that. How long do you see the adoption curve going for this kind of novel technology to get on people's
I think it's going to take, but again, so if we're talking the big distribution, I think all of those are great. And I'll use the example of Impossible and Beyond Meat, because they're two of the bigger distributors, but those are what I would consider B2C. They make a product they're selling direct to consumers. Same, my understanding of Brave Robot, I think that's branded through a Perfect Day company. It's not going to a CPG A, B, or C. I'm not going to name them, but that's my point, is to get wider adoption. And that's part of the strategy many of these companies have, to go direct to consumers because they can get it out there faster. But I think if you want the broad application, large, the number of stores, the amount that's being sold, I think you're going to have to see us continue to move into the consumer product side. And that's kind of a second thing I can talk about our platform is today, since most of these facilities are an ad hoc facility of something built for another purpose that are making these ingredients now, there are no overriding players doing this in Europe, the US, South America. It's somewhat ad hoc, where when you think about food manufacturing, if I'm a big CPG, consumer products company and I'm going to roll out a new brand, I don't expect to make an ingredient in one part of the world and ship it around the world. I expect if I'm selling it in South America, Asia, and the US, I expect I'm going to make those ingredients or source them in that area. And that's a model we're trying to do by also not just bringing cost-effective plants, but in multiple geographies where a client, how food is made today, can do it on a distributed manner with one contract, not using, fermentation company A in Europe, fermentation company B in the US.
Gosh, so much to talk about. So you are anticipating how many factories then?
We're targeting 6 geographies ultimately: US, Middle East, Australia, Brazil, Europe, and Southeast Asia. We hope to do that. We've broken them into 2 compartments. We expect the US will likely be our first facility. We think the ability to get a facility up and running is a little faster here, and frankly, the market is just stronger. Most of the capacity today exists in Europe, is where most of the existing precision fermentation capacity is, and most of the demand, both for the products and for the technology providers, are in the US, because that's something interesting today. Although many of these novel protein products are fermented in Europe today, they can't be sold in Europe.
Right.
Europe, because they're from a GMO organism. So the vast majority are brought back to the US. So we're literally sending technology to Europe to manufacture products that have to be brought back to the US because of a lack of US manufacturing capacity.
Yeah, it's funny, when I first met you, you wouldn't remember this. It was at the Glasswell Syndicate, I want to say in 2019, but it could have even been 2018. And at that time you were predicting there's not enough manufacturing capacity. And you told us all, the VC venture capitalists that were in the room, this is an issue. And that was 3 or 4 years ago. So I see that this is only exasperated since then. We have more entrepreneurs here coming up with creative ideas, and all around the globe. Imagine Dairy, and I can't name them all, but Imagine Dairy in Israel, and Super Brood, and you just have so many innovators working on this. But as you say, this lack of capacity. So let's say you do have your facility up and running in potentially the Midwest. I'll ask you where exactly, if you'll share it with me in a minute. Do you imagine you'll be running at full capacity when you start? What kind of demand are you seeing from the entrepreneurs?
We're building initial facility and then a larger commercial facility. We're not disclosing the actual size, but it's the market demand. I mean, if you take any of the market studies out there, Good Food Institute's numbers, A.T. Kearney, Blue Horizon, Boston Consulting Group, there's 4 or 5 management studies. Take the numbers and cut them 5-10 fold. It's still significantly more than we plan to build, or we even think can be built in the near term. So we're pretty confident, one, that demand will be there. Plus, we also believe by being a new, more efficient platform, even if we're just competing against the existing network of legacy facilities, we believe we'll have advantages in efficiency and cost structure that will make us beneficial.
No, I can see that absolutely, and I can see the demand, but I wonder, is there a concern for sharing or losing IP when one goes into a co-manufacturing situation, be it plant-based foods or fermented proteins? There's always a concern that the next company that comes in right behind you to produce their stuff is going to have some knowledge of your IP. What about that?
I would never say it's not a concern, but the industry today, so in my consulting practice before I founded this venture, I was involved in probably 20 or 30 contract manufacturing searches, helping companies find fermentation facilities. What I found about the existing network is they are very good. Trust me, I've tried to find out about other people's processes as you're in a fermentation facility. They do a lot. Usually as you go to these facilities, and this is true in the pharma industry too, they usually won't use client names. They'll use, each project has a code name. They Usually the IP's in two forms: the organism and potentially some of the processing technology. The organism is stored in different secured areas with remote access. I guess what I tell you is, I kind of come back to the pharma industry. You have pharma CMOs that are making different competitive drugs at times. It is done successfully in other areas. Again, companies need to guard their IP, but I also think there comes to a point you also have to look at what's out there done in other industries and try and adapt to it.
So do you have any contracts already in place? Innovators
No,
saying we want in?
well, we've talked to people who are interested. We're intentionally moving forward with the project first, realizing it's going to take us in the range of a couple years to build this first facility. We're intentionally waiting till we've finalized site selection and move forward, because there's a lot of projects over the years that have said they're going to be built, move forward, and there's a lot of skepticism out there. We believe just with the timing cycle, we're better off moving forward on the project. And at the point we have a project under construction, we think that will differentiate us from a lot of the other options out there. And we think it's plenty of time. Usually what I would tell groups that I was doing a contract manufacturing search for, you need to secure sites. It takes about 6 to 12 months to do the technical transfer and get into a big fermentation site. With a 2-year project cycle, we believe we have plenty of time to do that. And we're frankly better off moving the project forward first and then making a decision on who the right customers are as it gets closer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Are you looking at government funding at all? You said that agronomics and CPT, which are leaders already in the space, so it makes sense that to protect their other investments in the innovation side of this, that they would want to invest in the infrastructure. Are you looking at any government funding or staying with venture capital?
No, we're using venture capital. Obviously, we want to bring in other funding sources. What I would say is, while we're open to and interested in government funding, I do believe it's often delayed the industry. I've seen people wait years to get government funding.
Yeah.
So if we can get it as part of our process, we're certainly very interested in it. I think for the first facility we're going to build, which we're calling a launch facility of kind of mid-size, we're more open to doing the majority of it on equity if we have to. We're looking at some debt mechanisms. We think there's options. We think there's grant mechanisms. It's really proving it out to make sure the bigger facilities, which are much more capital, that we can prove it out so that we can go into much more of a traditional project finance where we get a much higher amount of debt leverage. Because for most first of a kind facilities today, it's very difficult to get what I'd call traditional debt. So,
yeah, I was going to ask you that if you thought you might go traditional banking debt and get some of that in the future. Also, by the time you build and scale your pilot and then start on your next larger project or facility, there might be more government funding in place. Again, we talked earlier about alternative energy getting so much money, alternative vehicles, electric vehicles. And so, we talk about this in the public markets, we're about 7 years behind that. So, you start adding your 2 years here and 2 years there, and you might start seeing some of that come through. And then this being de-risked by your pilot program working, and the food manufacturing world and the food world in general already shifting so much in 2-3 years out from now that you might have a better opportunity getting funding. You might not know the answer to this, but for electric vehicles and alternative energy, where did they primarily get their funding when they started doing facilities that would build solar panels, for example?
I mean, my understanding from my kind of renewable energy days, most of that was governmental. The other thing I would say is, in this conversation, although our first facility we're looking at being in the US, there's a lot of geographies, unfortunately, for the US that have a lot better structure for governmental funding. We've certainly been in significant discussions with groups in the Middle East, with groups in Australia. They have very strong programs both there. Some in Southeast Asia, some in Europe, some not quite as much. So it's certainly not just the US. The US You know, the US, as well intentioned as they've been, most of the bio-based funding has come through the Farm Bill focused at biofuels. And
Hmm.
I've worked in the biofuels industry. I've certainly used that money, but it's it's not been a clean path to pivot that to food. A lot of the funding that biofuels could get has not generally had a similar program for food. So that's held back somewhat the US compared to other geographies.
Hmm. So for now, primarily, you're still dependent then on venture capital until you can work out that path to either more government funding or de-risking your first project so that you can get debt funding. Does the logic work with those that you are pitching for funding, that you sort of maybe follow the path of, let's say, the semiconductor? So rather than invest in the Dell computers or Apple, you can invest in the semiconductors and be a part of all computers. And if you were smart enough to invest in semiconductors 10 years ago, you're probably pretty happy right now.
Yeah, and I have heard people, when you talk about large infrastructure industries, I've often seen uh, the semiconductor industry get referenced because it is also a capital intensive industry. For those of us listening to the debates in Washington, D.C., over the CHIPS bill and things, things have not been built in the U.S. in recent years.
That's right.
You can certainly debate the reason why, but it's a similar industry in that it's fairly capital intensive, and many strategic geographies are looking at incentivizing. And I think that's important because a lot of the interest we're seeing is not just for novel proteins and greenhouse gas reasons. It's also food security. Coming through COVID and things, you're seeing a lot of geographies in the world that are looking to try and have more food security. Probably the most obvious that you see is Singapore's had a strong push with their, what is it, 30 by 30? I forget the
30 by
exact
30.
numbers. Yeah, 30 by 30. But you're seeing other similar programs around the world in geographies. So some of the drivers are not just the traditional drivers. They're things that, quite frankly, often motivate governments more, because when you start talking about things like food security, that often gets a little higher priority.
Yeah, I actually think we're going to see more government funding. I understand why you wouldn't want to wait for this and how that can slow things up. Certainly, nothing defines bureaucracy like governments, but also you cannot have political legitimacy if you have food insecurity. That's the first thing to
Hmm.
topple a government. So I see that as sort of an existential crisis for politicians who perhaps look to their own safety, for their job safety first.
Hmm.
So I think that you're going to see more in the next 5 years, governments around the world. I don't know where the US will be in that, but I think you'll see more in the Middle East, as you mentioned. They're
Hmm.
definitely a food security concern. And continued in Southeast Asia and Israel as well. And
Hmm.
it'll be interesting to see where the European Union falls on this, because they're so staunch against GMOs, which personally,
Hmm.
from my perspective, again, not being an engineer, I think it's hard to feed the world if you're not going to include GMO technology at some point in the supply chain. It might be
Hmm.
only in seeds, changing how seeds are structured so that they're more prolific or they are insect repellents, et cetera. Do you have any thoughts about Europe and their GMO stance?
I don't. It's not an area. I mean, I've certainly dealt with it. I probably talk to many of the same people you do. What I hear from people I trust, I'm hearing 3 to 5 years. They're making progress.
Mm.
I'm also hearing, because it's similar even in China. And again, what I hear is that China somewhat has a history of following European food policy more than the U.S. So that while there's no guarantee China would follow Europe, that would be one of the more likely triggering events to
Mm.
potentially open up things in China to be more open to some of these foods from synthetic biology.
But no one has a food insecurity problem like China does.
Yeah.
So I would think China would want to get on this very quickly. Europe maybe has the luxury of not having to rush things, but I would think for China that it's
Hmm.
a point of big concern. They are so dependent on, folks like us who ship them
Hmm.
live animals. And if your trade talks aren't going well, you don't want to be in that position where your opponent controls your food. So I
Hmm.
think it'll be very interesting. As we all know, we talk about it here on this show, the Chinese government put cultivated meat and other plant-based initiatives in their 5-year agricultural plan. So
Hmm.
that also woke the US up. So
Yeah.
politics now playing really a role in our food. What kind of demand do you think there will be, if any, from the consumer? And my point there is, I was walking down the food aisle in Chicago, random
Hmm.
grocery store, and I saw Perfect Day on the shelf. Excuse me, Brave Robot,
Hmm.
with no explanation. There it was, sitting there next to all the other ice creams, not in the vegan area, but
Hmm.
in the ice cream area. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. They thought that it didn't even warrant a conversation. What do you think about that?
I think that's where we need to go. I mean, so I moved to Texas about 3 years ago. Um, I was not able to get the Impossible, consumer package product when they came out with their 12 ounces. Even though I'd worked there, I couldn't get it initially. I had done work over the years with Eat Just, and I couldn't get their scramble product either. Both are in my store now, and they're,
Yeah,
like you say,
yeah.
it's definitely more mainstream than it was, and I think that's where we need to be. And I guess the thing I would put out there, and this isn't really our premise because we'll make whatever people want, but I hear a lot more in the industry talk about we've spent a lot of time trying to make replicates, something that's just like a burger or just like some other product. And not that that's bad, but I hear a lot of the food scientists saying, why don't we just focus on making things that people want to eat, not necessarily replicating the legacy of what we've eaten in the past, if you follow me. So, one thing, and I've had the opportunity to travel the world a lot with, and what I like to say is when you build facilities, you don't go to the big cities. You go to the
Right.
very rural
Sure.
areas in these countries. So it's a little more, in every country, the cities can buy a little more high-end food than the average, family, be it the U.S. Midwest, rural Brazil, rural Asia. And I'm often amazed by just the different food products I see, culturally. And, I think, and this is probably a little more directed at the US, I think we're probably at times a little less adaptive than other cultures to trying different things. So, hopefully, as we continue to innovate, and again, I worked at Impossible. I have many friends still there. I've eaten the Impossible Burger. I've eaten the Beyond Burger. One is a replicate. One's not. Beyond, I don't believes they're making something that someone believes they're eating a beef patty. Impossible's much more like that. Which one do you? As I tell people, which one do you prefer? I see advantages in both of them, and I think we have to look at it more that way, both making the replicates and also making products that people just want to eat from a more sustainable non-animal source.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the bottom line for me where I come down on this is that the consumer wants choices. And you walk
Hmm.
down the chip aisle and you think like, "Oh my gosh, it's baked, it's fried, it's a square, it's a triangle." I mean, there's,
Hmm.
it's barbecue flavor, it's not barbecue flavor, it's got ridges, it doesn't have ridges. And you just think of the seemingly small points of differentiation I see in the chip
Hmm.
aisle or the packaged bread aisle. Bread with honey, bread with sliced, bread not sliced, bread with wheat and the whole wheat,
Hmm.
half wheat, half gluten. So I think there's room for both. I mean, ultimately, the food supply system is enormous. 8 trillion. I think if you look at the entire food market right now, meat would be about 1.4, 1.5 trillion. So I think consumers want choices. And what they don't realize yet, maybe today, but they soon will realize, is that they actually have not had any choice.
Hmm.
It's been chicken wing or chicken breast. It's been hamburger, steak, or meatball. I mean, it's just very few choices. And I think now you'll be able to get, do you want plant-based meat? Do you want cultivated meat? Do you, want it from fermented proteins or, from mushrooms, or where do you want to get your proteins? So many more different options, which is kind of a question I had for you. It might be your expertise coming out of Impossible Foods, but I wondered why fermented proteins and not, let's say, plant-based co-manufacturing plant, because that also has a shortage.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's simply that my expertise is
Mhm.
fermentation. I've been involved some in kind of the more traditional soy isolation technologies, and some of the vegetable oil processing. It's just not my technical area, and I definitely think there's a lot of infrastructure need there too. It's much bigger volume, so at least my understanding, and I'm far from an expert in the space, but even with, the big push into pea protein, pea was seen as a big alternate to soy. There was a belief it had a lot of advantages. Roquette's bringing on a big facility, and I guess
Ingredient as well.
yeah, up in Canada and stuff. But my understanding is they've just, as some of these products have become more popular, you've seen the prices go up because of supply issues and things, and just it's there's advantages and disadvantages to both. You have the infrastructure of both the being able to process the large amounts of, be it soy protein or pea protein. You also have to grow them agriculturally, so if you're going to
Right.
double or triple capacity, you
Yeah.
have to have the farmers that want to grow it, and it definitely is a multi-year process, especially in the terrestrial plant side.
hmm So let's talk about that. Then you mentioned farmers. I think that's really interesting. So something that I hear all the time is, if we go into alternative proteins, be it plant-based, fermented protein, cultivated meat, biomass fermentation, we are displacing farmers. And I always say, well, there's lots of opportunity to grow novel plant-based protein for those plant-based
Hmm.
products. But here, as you look at the jobs that potentially could be created as you go to, I'm going to assume, depressed economies. Perhaps I have that wrong, in rural, let's say, starting in America. What kind of job growth might you anticipate from one of your plants?
It's the thing I would say is most of these go in rural areas because that's where the sugar, the power, the labor is reasonably priced. It's where most of things are manufactured today, in the general industrial Midwest, all the way Ohio down to Iowa and other areas. You get less large scale manufacturing on the coastlines,
Yeah.
and they're very good jobs compared. I don't care what geography you're going to. They're often paying 2, 3 times the average wage, and that's true of. I mean, it's true of biotech in general. Even having spent a lot of time in the Bay Area before I moved to Texas, the economy there is very good for the research side. It's just every study I've seen on the jobs generated, they're of a quality, a pay. They generally come with benefits. They're generally
Yeah.
the more sought after within the geographies they're within.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. So it's a strange conversation, and I don't want to overgeneralize. It is indeed its own 1 2 hour conversation we could
Hmm.
have. But could this be? I'll sort of leave it as a question. Feel free to comment, but we won't resolve it here today. Could this be, as we shift the global food supply system, a return to manufacturing in the US and a return to these kind of jobs? I don't know all the numbers and the inflows and outflows, but it seems like for some folks that might leave the farming world and get this kind of rural job, it could be very profitable for them personally.
Yeah, and again, I personally don't see a big direct link. I mean, the number one feedstock you're going to need
Sugar.
for a fermentation facility is sugar coming from corn. So
Yeah.
whether they're feeding corn to livestock or converting it to sugar to make proteins, I'm certainly not the agricultural expert, but I just don't see how it materially impacts a lot of these. And the other thing is, these proteins are being, it's, I don't know what the numbers are for a lot of these additives, but many of them are at 1, 2%. The different precision protein ingredients you make into agricultural matrix. Those are often soy proteins, pea proteins. So, you know, for every fermented protein you make, you're going to need 50, 75 times on a weight basis more agricultural protein to go into the product. So, you know, I myself don't see the fear that for the average farmer that it has a material ability to displace their products.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. So we talked about like, well, you've got this pilot plant that you're going to do with venture capital primarily, but hopefully there'll be more government spending and de-risking such that traditional products might become available to you. What about the corporations already specializing in fermentation? So I think of AB InBev and Molson Golden and those already who have great knowledge about fermenting. Are they partnering with you or interested in this conversation?
You know, have talked to many of them. You know, the sugar producers, the ADMs, the Cargills, the Ingredions. You also have the more traditional fermentation companies. Certainly have had conversations with all of them, and some of them are discussing in various ways of getting in the space. It just historically so far has been an industry that's, you know, it's more of a venture profile. You know, for the big companies to enter the space, they're used to proven offtakes, proven markets, you know, the proven technology. So it's just something that has not, you know, we haven't seen as quick a movement on that side as we believe needs to happen. So we believe it's going to be more of a venture funded lead in this space.
Yeah, that's interesting because even there, the larger corporations finding it more sexy, if you will, to back innovation and learn from entrepreneurs and get some of that R&D from them and have some sharing there, then it is sexy for them to get involved in infrastructure, which is kind of business as they know it. That's not really moving the needle in a way for them. But as this sector grows, I'll be keen to know if that changes because I actually think it could. Okay, well, as we wrap up here, so much about what we're talking about is the future. So I would be remiss if I did not ask you, let's say 3 years out, where do you think fermented proteins will be 3 years from now? You will by then have your first pilot plant up and running.
Correct. I would say launch plant. So this is a commercial, it's a smaller scale commercial facility. It's the reason I say that, to me, a pilot plant is an R&D facility. All our facilities, we're a commercial manufacturing platform. I often have people ask me why we're not looking at doing the scale up. And I tell them, listen, there's a great need for scale up. There's people doing good work, but we believe the biggest gap is in the commercial manufacturing side. You know, where do I think the proteins will be? I do believe, having been in this space almost 15 years now, I see a lot of technologies that are really getting far enough both in their process development and in the offtake. You know, you've seen a lot of the, you know, Impossible and the motifs of kind of the meat space has moved ahead, I would argue. I think you're seeing a lot of push in the dairy space, the caseins, the eggs, the milks. Those are the ones I think you're really going to see more progress in the near term. It just seems like there's a lot more technologies closer to commercial scale and in a product that maybe is in a matrix or a platform that's a little, you know, many of us have been drinking things like almond milk for many years. You know, it's maybe a little more acceptable is not the right word. It's not as out of bounds to think of something that isn't a animal-based milk as often it is maybe in a novel chicken, a novel meat that's just not as common.
Well, I think it will be very interesting to see 3 years from now how much of your launch facility is dairy as we look to really crack that code to cheese. Fermented precision fermentation is really the key there. So Perfect Day has done it with ice cream through their relationships, joint ventures, but I think cheese is the one that everyone's waiting for. So we'll see, and there's so many active in that space. So we'll see where your launch facility is on that scale, if you're doing more the meat or more the dairy. Do you have a guess where you'll be? More meat, more dairy?
No, I mean, we're intentionally trying to build a platform that is cost effective at making the protein. I mean, for the most part, if it's a what we would call a secreted protein, so you grow the organism up and it puts the protein into the broth that you separate out, whether that ends up as a protein in the meat space or in the dairy space, the processing technologies are
Is this
fairly similar, and we believe the economics will be driven by developing a platform that can service multiple similar technologies. It just makes more of a cost-effective structure.
Mhm. Yeah, certainly that makes sense. Again, we're back to semiconductors and computers.
Now,
So you are making the ingredient that anyone can use. I'm grossly overstating, but pretty much anyone can use to make their alternative meat or their alternative dairy. So
mhm.
very interesting. So as we wrap up here, I'm wondering, what do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now?
What do I wish I knew? Boy, 10 years ago, so that, you know, I was just starting at Solazyme. They had gone public. I led the design build of their facility in Brazil in a partnership with ADM. What do I wish I knew? How hard it was to build a first of a kind facility in a foreign country. It was one of the most interesting things I had done, but it was a little bit harder than I thought maybe it would be. Beyond that, the thing I've learned is a lot of these adoption cycles, the last 10 years has really been head down, predominantly in the precision fermentation and novel protein space. And just seeing that although there's a lot of good technologies moving forward, the adoption has been slower than I really expected. But I do believe you've seen real movement in the last 2 or 3 years into the space.
hmm Do you think we'll continue at this rate? So obviously we had COVID, this enormous tailwind for people staying at home, Googling their food, what they
Mhm.
eat, so they can stay healthy. And the repercussions from that is they're also realizing when they went to Google the impact of our global food supply system on the environment. So we had incredible years, 2019, 2020, 2021, primarily until maybe the last quarter. Do you think that rate is sustainable?
I think so. I think it's a lot of it's going to be this manufacturing capacity to some degree, as you said. It just has to be getting these products out on the shelf in the average store. You may have people going for them like I was searching my store for these products every day. You know, my goal is when somebody buys it because it's a good product, not, I'm not against people making a conscious decision, but you know, and I'll give a tip of the hat to my old boss, Pat Brown, when he was at, Impossible. His goal was to make something that people ate because it's what they wanted to eat, not because, he certainly wasn't against people eating it for the right reason. But the feeling being, if you're going to get it adopted widely, people have to just eat it because they want to eat it, not necessarily for other reasons.
Taste first.
Yeah.
Nothing changes there, folks. We are who we are. It has to taste good, or what's the point? If you're running around, you have a busy day, and things are not going your way, is there a phrase that you say to get yourself back in the groove?
Um, Boy. I had a boss years ago that used to tell me, "Suck it up, cupcake." So that is one there's times when I'm feeling down, and it was kind of the speech your mother would give you, how there's people in the world with worse. And trust me, the more you travel the world, you feel out, and you realize, and I mean this sincerely, how the things we worry about as troubles are nothing compared to what most in the world. So that there's times I'm feeling down. That's something I will kind of give myself a self motivational speech of, you know, realize that, you're getting to do what you want to do every day. And I do feel
Mhm.
fortunate to do that both in my consulting practice, which I've stopped, and now in Liberation Labs. I'm doing what I really enjoy doing every day. And there's not a lot of people that get to do that every day.
Mhm. That is a joy. Most definitely. Suck it up, cupcake. That's one I'll remember. I get a lot
Yeah.
of those, but never suck it up, cupcake. So thank you for that. My last question for you is, again, you are running around, you're very busy. Is there, and you don't have time for lunch, is there a go to snack that you eat?
Yeah, I mean, not as much, on the snack side. One I've gotten kind of hooked on is red beans and rice. I make it a lot, and a lot of times I'll just keep it in the fridge and use it to snack on it. I've over the years, part of the downside, I've worked from home for many years now, even before COVID, and I've learned anything that's very easy to eat, like a chip or a cracker,
Can't
can't
have it.
really exist in my
No,
house.
me neither.
If
No
it's the
chocolate.
threshold
No.
of I have to cook it and do something, so I try and have more cooked food that I can just heat up. And the other thing is, my wife's Italian and definitely comes from that Mediterranean lifestyle. And just, when in doubt, eat raw, fresh food. We're big fans of farmers markets and things, and which is very much the Italian way. And just, I make a lot of products that are more of a more complicated food nature, but there's certainly in a lot of the vegetables and fruits, those are certainly a great way to go.
I couldn't agree more. I have lots of fresh fruit around. I have red peppers that I can cut up and dip in hummus, and I make my own snacks. So I do things with a fermented product, tempeh, and also tofu. I bake them and I put spices on them, and I use particularly for the tempeh, I slice it up really thin, and then I make my own crispy snacks. So that way I stay away from chips, because if it's in my house, it's gone,
Yeah.
which is a bad thing for me. So I want to thank you, Mark Warner, for all that you do, all of your knowledge drop here on this show, but also for the industry as a whole. I'm very excited because I think Liberation Labs paves the way. And although you are doing I'll say novel launch facility, I do think others will follow in your path. I think you're paving the way. And what that's going to mean is that financing for this infrastructure that is so critically needed is going to shift. So the more Liberation Labs that are out there, and you, of course, leading the way with 5 to 6 facilities, hopefully around the globe, I think that's really going to change how people see investing in this area. And it's such a critical part to the growth of our sector. So thank you for all that you do. I will say that I will follow up with you right after this. So you stay put and don't go away. But everybody else on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, thanks for being with me today. And thanks for all you do. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Don't go